All right, Brad, you're good.
Good evening and welcome to P&P Live. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine. And thanks for joining us here online, where we've been able to move many of our events in response to the current pandemic and continued need for social distancing. In this virtual format, you'll still be able to ask a question of the author if you'd like. To do so, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screens. And in the chat column, you'll find a link for purchasing this evening's featured book, The System by Robert Reich. Here's a copy of the cover. We're delighted to have Robert with us this evening. Anyone who's followed his 17 previous books, other writings, and spoken commentaries over the years knows his strength as a public policy thinker and articulate and engaging public speaker. Over 40 years, he's not only taught government and politics at major universities, including Brandeis, Harvard, and during the past decade and a half, UC Berkeley, but he's also served in government several times, most prominently as Secretary of Labor under Bill Clinton, and before that in the administrations of Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. He's also a founding editor of the American Prospect magazine, co-founder of Inequality Media, which is a nonprofit digital media company, and co-creator of the 2017 Netflix documentary, Saving Capitalism, and the award-winning 2013 film, Inequality for All. In The System, Robert passionately makes the case that our political and economic system is rigged in favor of moneyed interests, which has caused great inequality in our society and poses a grave threat to our democracy. It's a familiar argument, of course, but Robert lays it out with characteristic clarity and cogency. And as a rhetorical device, he zeroes in on Jamie Dimon, the head of JP Morgan Chase, singling him out as emblematic of a self-interested elite who, while espousing corporate social responsibility, continue to profit from an oligarchic system and do little to reform it. The solution, Robert contends, is a huge multi-ethnic, multiracial coalition to push through an agenda of bold systemic change. Publishers Weekly called Robert's critique incisive and authoritative, and a New York Times review said Robert has, quote, an almost unmatched ability to make insightful observations about the nation's inequities. So Robert, the screen is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Brad, and thank you all for coming tonight, virtually, that is. It's an odd day to talk about the system, an odd day in many respects. I mean, it is the day that Joe Biden is going to be accepting the nomination for the Democratic candidacy for president. It's a day that began with Steve Bannon being arrested for fraud, for taking allegedly millions of dollars to build the wall that was supposed to keep out of America people who were putatively crooks and robbers and stealers. It's a day where there are fires all over California. I happen to be about 4 miles away from a fire right now that is raging, and an evacuation warning has been put out. I don't think that I will have to leave you during the next hour, but if I do, it's only because there is a fire nearby. But the reason I raise that fire alarm is because there are fires raging all over America, kind of not only literally, but also figuratively. We are in the midst of the worst public health crisis in perhaps American history, certainly over the last 100 years. Since the pandemic of 1918, we've seen so far 172,000 Americans die in this pandemic. We've got the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. So in all these respects, the system, the title of my book, The System, seems to be off track, not just letting us down, but creating a kind of pandemonium, not just pandemic, but pandemonium, political, economic, social, health crises, public health crises. Uh, and I want to suggest to you that there are some relationships between all of these. In my book, I approach it as a system. The reason I entitled the book "The System" is because we're in the habit of kind of being in silos, whether it's the environment or public health or whatever it is, or politics or economics, and we tend not to regard what we're inside of in systemic terms, but it is indeed a system. And over the last, 50 years, I have been a part player in that system, and I've taught about this system, and I've written about the system. And what have I learned? Well, a few things I've learned about the system and that I have in the book. One thing I've learned is that it's all about power. That is, politics and political scientists often don't talk directly about power. It's hard to measure. Economists almost never talk about power. They talk about supply and demand and macroeconomics. But in fact, if you drill down a little bit under politics and economics, what you see is it really is all about power. Who has power, who doesn't. And power has a lot to do with who has the wherewithal, the money. And who has the money has a lot to do with who has the power. If you get my drift, there is a direct relationship between what has happened over the last 40 or 50 years in terms of inequality, stagnant wages, concentration of economic power at the top, and a deluge of money into our political system that all but drowns out the voices of average working people. In 2015, just before the 2016 election, I was doing some research for this book, The System, out in the Midwest. And I was in the Rust Belt in Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio. I was in North Carolina, in Missouri, undertaking a kind of free-floating focus group, asking people about the economy and politics and asking people about how they thought the system was working. What did they feel was wrong with it? What was right with it? And I also asked them at the same time, because the 2016 election was on the horizon, I asked them who they were most interested in as a possible presidential candidate and as a possible president. At that time, Jeb Bush, it seems like centuries ago, but Jeb Bush was the leading Republican candidate and Hillary Clinton, obviously the leading Democratic candidate. But when I asked people across the Midwest and the Rust Belt, and even into some southern states, who they were most interested in 2016, what I got back consistently, no matter who I asked, from a majority of people, was one of two names, either Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump. In fact, I would say probably 10, 15, 20% of the people I talked with said Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump in the same breath. They would say, we're interested in either Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump. When that happened to be the first time I thought I was hearing things, I thought that couldn't possibly be right, because Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, well, they seem to me to be on opposite ends of the continuum of the human species. But actually, what I got back from those focus groups, now remember, this is 2015. This is just before the year of the election of 2016. What I got back from people is they said, well, these are two people, Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, who will shake things up. They will shake up the establishment. And then I would ask, well, why is it so important to shake the establishment up? And people would say back to me, and these were people who identified themselves as, some of them Democrats, some Republicans, many of them independents. They said back to me, because the system is rotten. It's rigged. It is rigged against me. Now, interestingly, I had heard almost the same thing when I was labor secretary, and I'd go out to many of these states that had large workforces who were who had been in unions. But it wasn't as angry and it wasn't nearly as cynical. Uh, People said, yes, I'm working hard and I'm working harder than ever and I'm not getting ahead and there's something profoundly wrong. But they didn't use the expression, the system is rigged against me. There was no sense of a conspiracy. They didn't ever talk about the establishment or the elites. But starting in 2015, I heard this again and again on the road. And in preparing the book, The System, those sentiments kept on ringing in my ears. Donald Trump was elected, in my view, on the basis of my interviews and a lot of other data and interviews I did, not purely because of racism. That's a very easy way of explaining it, and it's not completely accurate. Because we've had racism in this country for 300 years before the country was a country. We've had politicians use racial and racist tropes and memes for a very long time. Richard Nixon talking about law and order with the kind of dog whistle that everybody knew was about racism. Or George H.W. Bush talking about Willie Horton with a dog whistle that was about racism. Even Bill Clinton, not explicitly, but certainly when he was facing re-election and his crime bill and 3 strikes you're out and getting rid of welfare, well, there were shades of racism there. Ronald Reagan had talked about welfare queens. Remember that? So it can't be racism that put Donald Trump into the White House, or certainly not racism alone. The question is, why did racism become such a prominent, powerful issue by 2016? And I submit that it became as powerful as it did politically by 2016 because people were so angry. The working class, the white working class, was so angry that 40 years of stagnant wages and a rigged system seemed absolutely unmovable, unmanageable, that it was relatively easy for Donald Trump, a demagogue, to use that anger and channel it toward not just Black people, but also Latinos, Latinx, and immigrants and Muslims, and again, any hatefulness, any divisiveness, anything you could imagine that would, in a way, satisfy the, and I hate to say cravings, but needs for people who were so bullied and so pushed down for so many years that they felt that somebody needed to be blamed. It was in the interest of people at the top, at the very top, to have a candidate who was divisive in this way. Now, I'm going to try to be very careful about what I say now because I don't want you to misinterpret it, and I certainly don't want to give away the plot of the book, because if I give away the plot of the book, you may be less inclined to read it. But I'm going to suggest to you something that I think is extremely important and is going on even today. And that is that we have in this country a fundamental split politically, and it's not so neatly left versus right, or even so neatly Republican versus Democrat. The underlying conflict, the chasm, is between oligarchy on the one hand and democracy on the other. Now, when I say oligarchy, I mean in the way that the Greeks use the term, not the way the Russians use the term, but the way the Greeks use the term, ruled by a relatively small number of people who are so wealthy that their wealth translates into political power. They have control over society. We're not an oligarchy yet, but we are trending and have been trending toward an oligarchy for at least 40 years. As wages have stagnated The median wage has gone almost nowhere adjusted for inflation. More and more of the winnings, the gains, the economic gains, income and wealth have gone to the top. And a relatively small number of people at the top have not only gained a huge amount of the nation's wealth, the top 1% now owns about half of the entire economy in terms of the capitalization of Wall Street, but also a smaller number of billionaires and multimillionaires wield extraordinary political influence. Now, you who got to this program through Politics and Prose, a wonderful Washington bookstore, you know exactly what I mean. Some of you may even be working for the oligarchy, and I'm not blaming you. In fact, I'm not blaming anybody. The book is built around a fellow named Jamie Dimon. Jamie Dimon is the CEO of the biggest bank in the United States, JP Morgan Chase, one of the biggest banks in the world. Jamie Dimon is a Democrat, capital D. He also believes in corporate social responsibility. He and his bank have launched a number of programs to help the poor, particularly people of color in major cities. He's interested in education. He's concerned about the environment, he says. He says that he's a patriot first, and I believe that he believes that. But Jamie Dimon also has a tremendous vested interest in maintaining the structure and system as we have it right now, the system of power that is allocated right as it is right now. Jamie Dimon and his bank have actually been among the worst with regard to issues like redlining or supporting fossil fuels or maintaining policies that actually entrench power as it is right now, rather than change the allocation of power. Jamie Dimon's and Wall Street's, particularly JP Morgan's, social responsibility efforts are admirable in a way, but they are smokescreens for what is really going on. Jamie Dimon is also the head of the Business Roundtable, a group of 192 CEOs of major businesses. 181 of them signed a pledge a year ago, August. It seems like an eternity ago, a year ago, August, in which they say they said that they had responsibilities not just to their shareholders, but to all of their stakeholders, their workers and their communities and every place they do business. But over the last year, and even before they signed that statement, but certainly since they've signed that statement, they have not changed their ways in any way at all. In fact, they have kept wages down. They have fought unions. They have moved to non-union states. They have outsourced abroad. They have brought in machinery to replace their workers. They have done everything possible to maintain the notion and the reality that their shareholders come first. They have maximized shareholder returns. That is, after all, their job. That's what Jamie Dimon's job is. So why are they indulging this fantasy of stakeholder capitalism when they are the primary exponents of shareholder capitalism? Why is Jamie Dimon a Democrat, capital D, somebody who is bankrolling and continues to bankroll Democrats? Why is he so active politically? Why is he lobbying as strongly as he is for things like a tax cut? He was one of the chief lobbyists for the Trump tax cut of December of 2017 that cut wages by indirectly cutting taxes. When I say cut wages, I simply mean that the net result of that was not trickle down wage increases. It was actually a continuation of the policy of all of these major companies to push their wages down. The only people who gained from that tax cut were big corporations, their CEOs, their top executives, and their major investors. Jamie Dimon and his bank, and also other CEOs who signed that Business Roundtable letter a year ago, also continued to lobby for regulatory rollbacks, of health and safety and environmental regulations. They did that because obviously that would help their bottom lines, just as the tax cut would help their bottom lines. But for them to simultaneously say and allege that they were in business for all of their stakeholders, for their workers, their communities, all citizens, is simply belied by the reality of what those regulatory rollbacks have actually done. Our environment is now suffering, partly because of them, and will suffer more in the future. You see, my point is that it is a system. I now don't mean to pick on Jamie Dimon. He's an example of somebody who works inside the system, but who doesn't want the system fundamentally changed. If those executives, the 181 executives of the Business Roundtable who really cared about corporate social responsibility, you know what they do? They would push hard, they would lobby hard for public financing of elections. They would lobby very, very hard for a constitutional amendment to reverse Citizens United against the Federal Election Commission. In other words, they would do everything in their power to make sure that no set of corporate CEOs or corporations in the future had as much power as they have to overwhelm and suppress effectively the voices of the rest of America, to effectively overwhelm our democracy. Do you see what I'm getting at? Nothing that you may want this country to do, have a better public health system, have a better public health insurance system, have anything that most people and most workers in most advanced countries have: paid sick leave, paid family and medical leave, paid vacations, whatever you think that a civilized society should have. There's no possibility of having that in our present system, when so much money has gone to the top and so much of that money has infected and overwhelmed our politics. What's the way out? Well, the only way out, as Brad suggested, and here again, I want to be careful not to give away the plot too much, but really the way out is to overcome the divide and conquer strategies that have been used by the oligarchy for years to keep Americans battling against each other. Racism is a case in point. Racism actually is something that, although most people, the oligarchs, Jamie Dimon would say, obviously he's not in favor of racism. Most people who have great wealth and power in our country would say, no, we are not in favor of racism. And yet, racism is one of the major vehicles that has been used in this country for years to keep the white working class and the white poor separate from the black working class, the black poor, preventing a coalition from developing that could have the power to change the allocation of power in America. What we need to do, it seems to me, is go back to the kind of a society that my mentor, John Kenneth Galbraith, once talked about, a society in which democracy worked because there were many countervailing centers of power. We've got to understand that systemic racism is not endemic to our system, but it must be reversed, not only because it is bad in and of itself, but it's also bad because it politically demobilizes so much of the population. It makes it difficult for people to see what's really going on, where the money, where the wealth, where the power, where the dominance, where the influence actually lies. And so let me just say, on this day, when Stephen Bannon has been arrested, when Donald Trump, I think, has lost another round of court hearings with regard to whether his taxes are going to be released, when Joe Biden accepts the Democratic nomination for president, when the pandemic continues to claim 1,000 lives a day or more, when I am here in California almost in sight of a major wildfire because we have not dealt with, in any way, with climate change. I just want you to know how high the stakes are. The stakes in this upcoming election, the stakes for our society, the stakes for everything you may believe in and want for your children, your grandchildren, and their children, the stakes for what our generations are going to be leaving behind to future generations. The system has got to be changed, and it will be changed. The question is whether it will be changed in a way that reflects the values and needs of our people, and indeed the world, or whether it is going to be changed in a way that reflects the values and needs of a smaller and smaller number of extraordinarily powerful and wealthy individuals. Okay, I have a lot more to say, and we can talk a lot. I know that I hope some of you have questions. I'm going to go to the Q&A box right here, where your questions are going to be arrayed in front of me. Linda Parker, you ask, is it possible to achieve social and economic equity under a capitalist system which favors those who already have wealth and power? Linda, the answer to that question has got to be a yes. And maybe I am answering it through rose-colored glasses, but what's the alternative to capitalism? There's no country in the world that has a system other than capitalism. Even countries of the Nordic countries have social democratic systems that are fundamentally capitalist in terms of private property and the free exchange of goods and services. China calls itself a communist nation, but it's basically a capitalist nation. So I think the real question is, what form of capitalism are we going to have? Are we going to have a form of capitalism that provides a thick social safety net and substantial public investments in education, healthcare, in environment, in research and development? Or are we going to have the harshest form of capitalism you can imagine? Right now, the United States has socialism for the rich and harsh capitalism, the harshest form of capitalism in the entire world for everybody else. Next question, Jonathan Vidal, is that right? Oh, wait a minute, John Lightfoot. Jonathan Vidal, I'll get to yours, but John Lightfoot, you just jumped in. In the early 1990s, we adopted tax code section 162M, which tied executive compensation to corporate performance. Didn't that specific statute partially cause the trend line we see? And if so, couldn't we amend that regulation partially to address income inequality? John, you are right to some extent, but I think you're looking at a symptom of something rather than the cause. Now, that particular section of the tax code, 162M, I'm not a tax expert, but let me just get the tax code in front of me. I'll just envision it. Yes, I remember. That section allows corporations to deduct more than $1 million of executive pay if that executive pay is tied to corporate performance. In other words, if executive pay is in the form of stock grants and stock bonuses and stock options, then the pay could be anything, and the company could still deduct that pay from its corporate earnings as a business deduction. Well, that's a very important fact of life, but let me just make sure you understand that before the early 90s, when that tax code section 162M was adopted, it was possible for companies to deduct whatever business costs, including whatever executive pay they wanted to, from their corporate income. The only thing that that particular section did is it tied any income of executives over $1 million to corporate performance. Bill Clinton, you may remember, in 1992, promised to do something about executive pay. He said no pay over $1 million should be deductible at all. And then what happened? He became president, and he turned the issue over to Lloyd Bentsen, the late Lloyd Bentsen, who was Treasury Secretary, and to Bob Rubin, who was then head of the National Economic Council, and to me. And why did we not follow what Bill Clinton said in this campaign and just simply say no executive pay over $1 million can be deductible? It's okay if you tie it to performance. Well, you have to read another book of mine called Locked in the Cabinet to find out. Okay, Renee, Matthew, or Matto, I agree with you regarding income distribution. Do you have any sense of whether US comparative advantage so bad, that is, domestic costs are so high, that we've cut regulations, or is it just rent seeking? It's rent seeking, Renee. It's completely rent seeking. When I say rent seeking, I mean, people find it, that's a little hard for a lot of people to grasp. It's an economic term, meaning that it is an attempt, in this case, by corporations, by powerful people, to improve their position, to get wealthier. America's competitive position is not the position of American-based corporations. American-based corporations, big corporations, are worldwide. They are global. They have 30% of the shares of big global American corporations are owned by foreigners. They're making things and producing things and selling things all over the world. The competitiveness of American-based companies has only a tangential relationship to the competitiveness of America. The competitiveness of America, the United States, depends on what? Our productivity, yours and mine, and people who reside here. And that's one of the problems. Although productivity of Americans continues to rise, there is a widening gap between that productivity and the median wage. DC C. Chin, is that what your name is? What would be the first step we as citizens can do to bring the system closer to what the average citizen needs? Get big money out of our politics. Aaron Montes, what is a practical way to motivate corporations and businesses to increase wages and increase the standard of living for the lower and middle classes? Well, Aaron, we're not going to motivate corporations and businesses to do that. Corporations and businesses are motivated to maximize shareholder returns. Now, you could argue, and I have on occasion argued, that if you raise wages, you get more loyal employees, you cut the cost of turnover, it is better for you over the longer term. That may be the case. I still believe that's the case. But that's not the way the stock market is working. The stock market is rewarding executives on the basis of quarterly earnings. So if we're going to increase wages and increase the standard of living for lower and middle class Americans, we've got to invest in them, their healthcare, their education. We've got to raise the minimum wage. We've got to expand the earned income tax credit. We've got to provide more opportunities. This is not rocket science. But we've neglected all of this. And this pandemic is a good example. Joe Proctor, Jamie Dimon doesn't talk like he's smart. What's that all about? Is he, or is he a fraud who has gotten ahead? No, Joe, I've kind of researched Jamie Dimon. Actually, the reason I was particularly interested in Jamie Dimon, apart from him being a Democrat, capital D, and interested in social responsibility, a proponent of that, and head of the Business Roundtable, is a couple of years ago, he called me. I had written something that he didn't like. I was critical of him. And he spent the first 20 minutes of our phone call in a monologue. He just told me why I was wrong. And then I asked him if he was finished. And he then listened to what I had to say. He doesn't strike me as in any way a stupid man. I think he's very bright. As a business leader, he's very smart. And that's in a way, that's my experience. Corporate leaders are intelligent people. These are not unintelligent people. They're not bad people. I don't want to, and I want to get us away from vilifying. And this is really why I call the book The System. because it is a system. It's a system of power. It's a system of power relationships. The only way we change it is we change the power relationships. If you pluck Jamie Dimon out of JP Morgan Chase and put in somebody you like better, that other person would do exactly what Jamie Dimon is doing. Karen Pepper, what plan do you suggest for getting money out of politics? Well, Karen, take a look at the very first bill that was passed by the House of Representatives after 2019, when the Democrats took back the House. It is HR 1. It has in it the essential ingredients for getting big money out of politics. Now, we also probably have to have a Supreme Court willing to repeal or revoke Citizens United against the Federal Election Commission. But SR 1 goes a very, very long way. It's a good piece of legislation. It has sat on Mitch McConnell's desk now for 2 years, along with 249 other pieces of legislation. Brian Johnson, it seems that there are two sources of data, news, facts, because of CNN and Fox, making almost impossible a common set of facts. Do you have ideas on how to change this? Well, Brian, I am old-fashioned enough, and maybe I'm old enough to believe that there is something called the truth. There's something called logic. There's something called science. I don't believe that you can simply say Fox is the equivalent of CNN. I think Fox is actively distorting reality. I think CNN tries hard to report the truth. I think the New York Times and the Washington Post are trying hard to report the truth. They miss it sometimes, and they are corporate media, I understand, and they don't report exactly how it is, but they're nothing like right-wing radio or Fox News, and there is no equivalence there. An anonymous attendee, how can the US work to address these power discrepancies without prompting the rich and powerful to take their companies and businesses elsewhere? Well, anonymous, let me just say as clearly as I can that there are huge advantages to being inside the United States, to being a person who's a citizen of the United States and also a business in the United States. One big advantage, for example, is you get the protection of the United States. You get the protection of the United States military, if it ever came to that. You also have live in a democracy. You live in an environment that is, again, it was a democracy. It's less of a democracy now. I very often will say to people who maybe a wealthy person who says, I don't want to pay taxes as much here. I'm going to go abroad. Well, if you go abroad, you're going to pay more taxes, for one thing. If you're a big corporation, you're not going to get a lower tax burden in most European states. And if you go elsewhere, you're going to be regulated like mad. You have more freedom here in the United States than you do anyplace else in the world. Let's see, Jonathan Vital, I'll come back to you. My question is, why is the system perceived as a fringe view by the vulture capitalists and Wall Streeters who've drunk the Kool-Aid? Well, I don't know that Jonathan, I guess what you're saying is that what I have said so far to you, or what I point out in my book, The System, is a view that a lot of people on Wall Street or a lot of people who are in the oligarchy would reject. And maybe they would reject it, and they will reject it because they have every interest in rejecting it. But all I can say to you is everything that I have said to you tonight, and everything that I have put in the book, I can back up. And not only can I back it up, but I do have 50 years of experience, much of that time inside American government and politics, around presidents, and I've served in 3 administrations and worked around and with another. I'll tell you, the system is off the rails. We have to put it back on the rails. Michael Gavin, do we factor in on the topic of wage stagnation for the last 40 to 50 years? A cause is the labor pool has expanded. 50 years ago was mainly white males able to have access to a large working pool. If it's a factor in the numbers, what can we do to push wages up for all? Well, Michael, actually the biggest factor is not the numbers. The biggest factor is the deunionization of the workforce. In the 1950s and 1960s, over a third of American workers in the private sector were unionized. This gave them a voice. This gave them power. We're talking about power. This gave them power. Today in the private sector, 6.4% of workers are unionized. In other words, they have almost no bargaining leverage whatsoever. It's not numbers in terms of numbers of workers. It's really about power over who gets what. And Michael, you also had a question, how do we raise better healthcare as a government and not abandon the world to deal with the rise of China and not affect lending aid internationally as well? Thank you. I think I understand. How do we raise better healthcare as a government and not abandon the world to deal with the rise of China? Look, we are the richest country in the world. We also have the richest oligarchy in the world, and we also spend more, far more, on our military than any other country in the world. In fact, our military budget is larger than the military budgets of the next 5 countries, including China, together. If we didn't spend as much on the military, and we also had a tax system that was fairer, and we also didn't have a rigged market system, rigged for the benefit of those at the top, we would have ample resources to provide universal healthcare. And let me just add that our healthcare system right now takes 18% of our entire economy, the most expensive healthcare system in the world. And yet it is the least efficient healthcare system in the world because we cover a smaller fraction of our population than anybody else in the world. And let me just add that unless we eventually adopt Medicare for all or a single payer system, we're just going to go broke. Everybody's going to go broke. Lance Lawson, how can we get to a better economy when the GOP's core beliefs are not tied to the real world? Beliefs such as the global warming is a hoax, or Biden is a communist, and so on. Every proposed step forward is opposed by them almost by reflex. Well, Lance, we've just got to vote him out. But that's too glib. Let me just go back a step. When I was Secretary of Labor, I worked very closely with a lot of Republicans in Congress. Teddy Kennedy and Nancy Kassenbaum and I worked on a big bill with regard to changing our unemployment insurance system and worker training systems. I worked with some members of Congress who are still there. We're still Republicans, we're still there. But the Republican Party, since over the last 25 years, has changed very dramatically. It is no longer a party. It is a cult. It is only about Donald Trump. It has no principles. It has no ideas. It has no initiatives. It can't make a decision. It's incapable of deciding anything. It couldn't even come up with, after all of its bluff and bluster, it couldn't even come up with an alternative to replace the Affordable Care Act. It has not been able to come up with anything, any alternative to the HEROES Act that the House came up with in May to deal with the next set of problems coming out of the pandemic. It's not a party. We need 2 governing parties, and we are only now having or in possession of 1 governing party, and that's the Democratic Party. We need a Republican Party that's capable of governing and capable of thinking. Robert Nye, how concerned should we be about our soaring $25 trillion national debt? Robert, right now, when we have so much unemployment, joblessness, when we have a pandemic, when we have so much underutilized capacity, when small businesses are going out of business left and right, when we have so many structures, that is, office buildings and retail buildings that are empty, how concerned should we be about our national debt right now? Zero. This is the time to spend. Now, John Maynard Keynes has gone in and out of popularity, but he was most relevant and continues to be most relevant in a recession, a depression, a downturn. The government is the spender of last resort. The only way we can begin to get this economy going again is, number one, to get control over this pandemic, and number two, to put money in people's pockets so they can spend. Let me go to Jojo Hardy. Is it possible to give every US citizen money to invest in the stock market as a birthright? In other words, can we democratize shareholder value by expanding the amount of shareholders? Would this increase corporate power? Jojo, I think it's an interesting idea. And there have been a number of books written about providing every child with essentially a certain amount of money that can be invested, and through the magic of compounding, assuming the economy over time continues to grow, that is, there's going to be a business cycle, but over time the economy continues to grow, that child would do well. I think there's something to that. But I worry, you may remember when George H.W. Bush and even George W. Bush both proposed in different ways the idea that we ought to turn Social Security into shares of stock. That's a dangerous idea. It would make Wall Street very wealthy, but it would jeopardize the savings and jeopardize the security of millions of people. So while I do empathize, and I think it's an interesting idea to pursue, I don't want to pursue it to the extent that it substitutes for anything like Social Security or puts too many eggs in one basket. Even if it's an index fund, who knows exactly what the stock market is going to do? Jeff and Erdwin, how much time do we do have some time? Okay. Jeff, I have read some of Milton Friedman's publications. What would he say to us today? Well, I can't be presumptuous. I'd love to do it, but I can't be presumptuous. One thing that I could say, about 50 years ago, almost exactly 50 years ago, I think it was September of 1970, Milton Friedman wrote a very important article in the New York Times Magazine, interestingly, in which he said that the responsibility of corporations was to maximize shareholder returns. And he made the argument that the so-called corporate social responsibility took CEOs out of the business of that they were good at and what they should be doing. They were accountable, should be accountable to shareholders, and put them in the job of coming up with social policy, even though they were not accountable to voters. And he felt that that was wrong. Well, I think he was right. But one thing that Milton Friedman did not see, and he couldn't have seen because he was writing in 1970, is that over the next 50 years, we would see the greatest increase in corporate money inundating our politics ever in our history. Even if we haven't even seen this, if you adjusted the value of the dollar and went back to the Gilded Age, you wouldn't see this amount of corporate money in our politics. And if corporations are taking over our politics, then Milton Friedman's admonition that CEOs should not indulge in corporate social responsibility because that's the job of government becomes meaningless. The most important form of social responsibility, as I suggested before, would be to get corporate money out of politics. David Kaverman, what initial steps do you see as most productive to bring together the coalition you see as needed to make the changes you lay out? Well, it's already happening, David. Inside the Democratic Party, And it's happening actually among a lot of independents and even some never Trumpers. I'm interested, and I've been following this very carefully, that there is, and partly this is because of Trump and his outrageousness, and partly this is because of the pandemic and the toll it has taken, and partly because this is because of the economic consequences of the pandemic. And it's because of the consequences of climate change, which are now painfully obvious to all of us. All of these things come together. And I'm starting to see among some Republicans and many independents, and certainly a lot of Democrats, an attitude that I hadn't seen before, which is, number one, government is really important. Number two, we've got to have a government that is capable, that is really good at doing what it is doing. We've got to elect people and make sure that they appoint really smart people. And number three, that the private sector cannot possibly do it on its own, and that private investment depends on adequate and careful and smart public investment. Now, those principles, along with education, those principles are now being more widely understood. And public investment is now being more widely understood as healthcare and education, and obviously infrastructure, roads and bridges and pipes and everything like that. And also in a system that promotes democracy and also fights invidious systemic racial discrimination. DC Chin again, why would the working class or a working class person ever vote for the likes of Donald Trump? Well, another way of asking the same question is how did Trump do it? How did he pull the wool over the eyes? I'm thinking Trump lies. Why did he pull the wool? How did he get away with pulling the wool over the eyes of so many working class Americans? Well, partly, as I said before, he used populism, anger, the anger at the establishment, and he used, as I said before, racism, and he told lies like most people breathe. He tells lies. And he had the mouthpiece that's called Fox News and right-wing radio, magnifying his lies. And he said things that he never followed through on. He said, for example, he was going to make sure that American companies boosted wages and provided better working conditions, and that working families would get childcare. I mean, he made all sorts of promises. Now, why would they vote for him now, having experienced 4 years? Is the average person better off today than they were 4 years ago? Why is it that 38 to 40% of the electorate still tells pollsters they are in favor of Donald Trump? Believe me, I scratch my head about this, but I think it's partly because of such deep-seated anger and cynicism and rage still at the establishment, at the rigging, and it's still rigged, of the system, that they want to believe that Donald Trump is their savior. Rebecca Custis, what changes, if any, can be made for the stock market to better reflect the real world or the real state of the economy? The stock market has reverted its losses from March, and then some, despite 1 million new unemployment claims a week since March. It seems like it rewards stock buybacks, layoffs, and short-term quarterly gains versus long-term business development and business decisions that have a benefit to the economy at large. Well, Rebecca, you answered your own question. Well, that makes my life easier. Yes, the one thing you left out that's very important to understand is the Federal Reserve now is bailing out big corporations. It's taking over a lot of debt that has become junk bonds. Debt that it was accumulated. A lot of corporate America went pretty deeply into debt over the last 5 years in order to buy back its shares of stock and create a kind of sugar high in the stock market, artificially inflate those shares of stock. There was some inside dealing. For example, a lot of CEOs had stock options and stock grants, and they did very well with regard to those buybacks. And that debt, that cumulative debt, that corporate debt used for stock buybacks made the entire economy very fragile in the event of a major downturn. And the Fed has basically bailed out big corporations. It's sort of a larger version of what we did with regard to the big banks in 2008. The story is not being told, but it's a big reason why the stock market is doing as well as it is doing. Anonymous, you're back. What are your thoughts on a wealth tax in terms of feasibility, efficiency, and marketability? I am very much in favor. You're talking about a wealth tax of a sort that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren proposed. I am very much in favor because we need public revenue to do the kinds of things we need to do in this country, but B, the degree of inequality is very bad and unhealthy for our economy and for our political system. We have time for just one more. And let me take Christina Frasher. Is that how you pronounce your name, Christina? What are your thoughts on boycotting? Is that also a way of addressing and eating at the power of the elite? Christina, you must be talking about corporate boycotts. And I think that corporate boycotts have been shown to be more effective than I ever thought they would be. They have had an effect on Fox News. Some of the hosts who are being boycotted, who shall go nameless, are still there. But Fox News is feeling the effects of the boycott, and that corporate sponsor boycott wouldn't have happened if people had not put pressure on corporations. It's a difficult way of getting corporations to change their behavior, however. It's a last ditch, and I salute people who are engaged in corporate boycotts, but let me urge you not to forget about our democracy and about the importance of not just voting, but also being an active citizen. This is actually an important point to end on, and let me end on this point, therefore. One thing I have learned over the past 50 years that I've been in and out of politics and in and out of government and in and out of academia and writing books and doing all sorts of stuff having to do with our system, is that there is absolutely no substitute, nothing more powerful than citizens who are intent on change. But that change and that citizen activism is not and must not be limited to elections. Too many people get the people elected who they want, or don't get the people elected, and then they just give up on politics, at least until the next election. Please don't. Anything that gets done in Washington or in state capitals that's good happens because good people outside Washington or outside those state capitals are pushing good people. They're pushing good legislators and pushing good lawmakers to make it happen. In other words, our job really is not just November 3rd. Our job starts in many respects November 4th. Our job is to push for what's in the public interest. Our job is to overcome the dominance of the moneyed interests. Our job is to make our democracy work so we can get on with solving the many critical problems that are mounting up even as I sit here with you tonight. So again, let me thank Brad Graham and Politics and Prose, and thank all of you for your attention. It was my pleasure to talk to you and to answer your questions.
Thank you, Robert, for a very illuminating talk. And and one, let's hope, that does galvanize those watching to support and work for needed reform of the system. And let's also hope that you remain safe in your house there, and you won't have to evacuate because of the fire. To everyone who tuned in, thanks for taking part. As a reminder, the title of Robert's book is The System, and you can get a copy or several by clicking on the link that we've posted in the chat column. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.